Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Tech Done Different. As always, I'm your host, Ted Harrington, and with me today is our special guest, Lauren Zabierek, the Executive Director of the Cyber Project at the Belford Center at the Harvard Kennedy School. I hope I got all the parts of the title right.
Yeah, that was great.
Welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you here. I think the work you're doing is pretty awesome.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely talk about some of the work that you guys are doing there at Harvard, but I wanted to start by talking about or asking you about an aspect of your journey. You know, when you and I were talking the other day, it sounded like your path into the security realm was one that wasn't immediately oriented around security, and that sort of was an adaptation, I guess, that came later. And I'm always really interested in those kinds of stories because I think there's this misconception that, you know, in security, if you haven't been hacking a computer since you were 4, there's not a place for you. And you're clearly an example of that. I mean, the case. So maybe you could, for the benefit of our audience, kind of talk people through that part of your journey. Like, how did you get into security?
Yeah, absolutely. I also like to use my story as an example of that. I like to say in college, I remember taking a computer science class and I almost failed it. So, no one's as more shocked as me than for me to be here. But, while my career really hasn't centered around cybersecurity, at least from an early standpoint, it's always been around national security. And so I started my career in the military as an intelligence officer in the Air Force. And from there, I later went into a civilian intelligence analyst role where I did counterterrorism work and deployed a bunch of times overseas. I really did love that. What happened was in late 2015, early 2016, I left government, and somewhat unwillingly. My husband got a job up in Boston. And I tried to get what is called the joint duty assignment with the FBI up here, but it just didn't work out. And so what I thought was going to be sort of the most devastating thing was actually really one of the best things that could have happened. I happened to find this cybersecurity startup called Recorded Future. It was a small startup, way back then, and I like to say the person who hired me and the CEO really took a chance on me. But I think what they saw in me was that I was an analyst. And so, I think they were hoping and also saw that I could pick up the material very quickly. So I started out as a solutions engineer. So I would go with the salespeople to demo the software. So I literally started out just like basics, right? And there were times where I didn't really know what I was doing. And, people in those sales calls would talk about things like APT 29 and, certain CVEs and certain malware. And I really worked hard to understand that, what were those things that they're talking about? What were the advanced persistent threats? What was malware? What were the different vulnerabilities? So I really worked hard in that. And, after about a year, I transitioned to the post-sale side, customer success, where I really took my experience in the federal government and I built up the public sector practice. And so during that time, I became very interested in cyber policy because I really looked around at the landscape. And again, this was 2016 timeframe, and I kind of looked around and said, and because I was so new to this world, I thought, well, this is interesting. Some things seem to work okay, but I think there are things that we could probably do better as a country. And so I became very interested in the policy aspect of cyber. And so, I had deferred a year, but finally entered into the Harvard Kennedy School for my Master's of Public Administration. And I took that desire to really want to explore cyber policy to that. And, I was in Eric Rosenbach's class, the cyber policy class, and, I was that nerd in the front row, just constantly raising their hand and, calling me. But, I think he saw within me the desire to do something like this and the drive, really. And so when it came time to talk about jobs after graduation, he asked me if I would like to take this role, because Michael Solmeyer, my predecessor, had gone on to Cybercom, and if you know that name, he is now on the National Security Council as the, I think, senior director of cyber.
Very cool. So in your estimation, what is the relationship between national security and cybersecurity?
I like to say that cybersecurity is national security, but with the caveat that, in this case, the government can't, just protect us all. It's just such a fundamentally different construct than I think what we're used to from a traditional defense and, military paradigm. So, but from a national security standpoint, because the cyber domain offers adversaries from nation states, down to, even criminals alike, it offers them a capability, and offers them reach and, the ability to have an impact and have effects without having to put boots on the ground. And, as we've seen, there's so many, there's a lot of critical infrastructure sectors, for instance, but that's all, in our domestic system. And most of those critical infrastructure entities are really run in the private sector. So, and the military and the intelligence community, who are, normally tasked with our defense, can't operate in those spaces. And the adversary knows that. And so they seek to exploit, those particular aspects of our system. And they've done quite well, when you look at things like SolarWinds and, the Microsoft Exchange server issue, and just all of these operations that we've seen. I think more and more, adversaries are, really looking at how they can exploit that, our different states and all the different companies and our supply chains. It's like, we're pretty vulnerable. So I think it offers a very attractive target for those actors.
So if I was to hand you a magic wand, and with that magic wand, anything could happen to address this problem, what would the magic wand do? Like, putting aside the impracticalities of why it might be difficult to solve the problem, what needs to happen?
A lot of things need to happen, I think, across the board. Some of the things that we've looked at are, if we look at the international space, for instance, and that's been an area, I think, of study for, many organizations for the last couple of years, but, still we're at a place where there's just not a lot of rules in this domain. So certainly more rules and norms there. And, in an upcoming paper, we argue that, the SolarWinds incident and other operations that, may come to light really offer us, I think, the opportunity to finally sort of declare what we think is appropriate and not appropriate in cyberspace, and, get more of our like-minded allies and partners, things to sort of sign on to that. So, that's in the international realm. Things like supply chain security, how can we increase the resilience of our many different supply chains? And that's something that we're working on with, I'm part of the R Street Institute's Secure and Competitive Markets Initiative. So we're looking at different aspects of the supply chain and the security, or the strategy around that. And then something like, I think a lot of people in this space, have been, especially recently, talking about cyber defense, because it's clear that, there are elements of our offensive strategy that, I mean, how can, just a a relatively small group, I think, of, professionals, very good professionals, defend against all of the threats. We can't, again, because, of operating in quote unquote blue spaces. So how can we then increase our defensive posture? And that's another thing that we've been looking at the Cyber Project for, gosh, probably about a year and a half now. And we've done a number of interviews and a lot of research, and we're writing this paper and just trying to make it, as good as we can. But it's an idea, essentially, a couple of ideas on how we can move towards a more collaborative defensive environment across the nation, and improve the nature of our threat intelligence sharing across different entities. And then other things, emerging technologies and data, and just looking at various aspects of that. So there's so many different pieces to it. And then, of course, with diversity. So I'm a co-founder of the movement called Share the Mic in Cyber. And that is really predicated on the notion that diversity is national security. And diversity in cybersecurity is extremely important for a number of reasons, but chiefly to be able to identify and analyze threats that maybe aren't threats to a certain sect of the population, but do impact others, and to be able to see that and to be able to mitigate those threats. So the challenges are multifaceted, but yeah, certainly no shortage of work to be found.
So tell me about this idea. I've not heard it phrased that way before, and I find that really intriguing, this idea that diversity is national security. Tell me what you mean by that.
So yeah, great question. And I'll say that my co-founder in this movement, Share the Mic in Cyber, Camille Stewart, she says this just so well. But it takes the best and the brightest, and it takes our very diverse human capital to meet the threats, to meet the national security threats, the ever-growing, the ever-diversifying threats that we face, in this country. And I've heard people say this before, but our adversaries don't discriminate. So why should we? If we have just all these different kinds of problems that we're facing, shouldn't we therefore put forth people who can address these challenges in a multitude of ways, like almost like a layered defense sort of thing. If we have people who are good at X and people good at Y and people good at Z, shouldn't we put those people forth? Shouldn't we be able to help defend our nation with everyone we have to bear? It takes our human capital, and that involves, I believe, safety and security, economic security, health security, et cetera, for our people in order to do this. I mean, a sick and unhealthy population can't meet the threats to our national security as well as we need.
Man, it's amazing. I asked you a question about an idea that I hadn't heard before, and your answer revealed it in yet another idea, which I'm so fascinated by. And this idea of describing diversity as analogous to defense in depth. That's such a cool idea. Can you expand upon what your thinking is in that idea? That's awesome.
Oh, thank you. I think that was probably not necessarily intentional, but yeah, let's go with it. If you have someone who, if we just want to look at cybersecurity, for instance, take someone like me. I'm in cyber policy. I don't know how to do vulnerability assessment or pen testing or things like that. But there are plenty of, people who do. So to me, it's like, it's comparative advantage, it's competitive advantage, for instance, to to get the people who want to do these things, who know how to do these things, who are good at doing things, to do them, to bring those capabilities to the challenge. And if we don't get more people, and if we don't get people with different perspectives, then we're not going to understand those threats. And so, from a defense, or defense in depth standpoint, there's just so many different aspects, I think, to meet that challenge.
I like it. So can you elaborate on I guess there's two parts to this question. This might be a big answer to a question, so answer whichever part of it you want to succinctly, but what's the mission of the center that you run there at Harvard, and what is the work that you guys are focusing on right now? I mean, I'm reading that it's relating national security as cybersecurity as a national security issue, but I don't want to put words in your mouth.
So at the Belford Center, it's, the full name is the Belford Center for Science and International Affairs. And its whole premise is, ideas for a more, peaceful future, basically. And so there's all these different projects and programs within the center. So for instance, you have something like the Cyber Project. You also have the Future of Diplomacy Project. You have the Middle East Institute. You have the project on, managing the atom, and that's just 4 of the projects there. And so, we are very focused on, impactful, actionable policy research. So, things that we can hopefully present to not only the public, but to policymakers and, people in academia, et cetera, to push forth these ideas, in order to continue to secure not only our nation, but also, our values abroad with our allies and, in competition with adversaries as well.
And what do you think is the primary, maybe there's more than one, but if you had to pick one, what's the primary obstacle in the way of that brighter future you guys are working towards?
Oh, that's a good question. I think there's a number of obstacles. Certainly politics and different ideas and different visions for, how to get things done, or even whether to get things done. But, I think now with the current administration, there's obviously more of an appetite in these spaces to be more forward leaning and, push forth some of these ideas, which is great. But I think too, just looking around the world and seeing all the different challenges that we face. I mean, these challenges are multifaceted, from, economic issues to public health issues to security issues, and it's not just a black and white thing. So I heard someone the other day talk about how public policy is a way to engineer, public behavior or human behavior to get people to do the right thing. And so, I loved that. I thought that was great. And I think he's right. But there are, I think, different ideas of what the right thing is, across the world. And I think there are just different desires, I guess, and not only desires, but abilities to do the right thing as well. So it's just so multifaceted, all the different challenges.
Man, you just keep dropping golden nuggets on me all day today. So now what I just heard you say was that public policy is essentially social engineering, right? It's a technique to influence behavior.
I guess you could say that. I certainly didn't intend it that way. It's just but I see what you're saying, and I don't want to cast it in a negative light whatsoever.
Social engineering is a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah. I think in the cybersecurity world, we've been trained that it's not a good thing. And so I don't want to conflate it with the negative interpretation of that. But yeah, I think it's an important question. Like, how do you get people to do the right thing, and what is the right thing? at that time. And I think that question, it's a really challenging one.
So inherent in this idea, the right thing, if we put that in air quotes, of course, denotes ethics, denotes a common agreed upon set of norms and beliefs, etc. To what extent is a discussion of ethics important and relevant to the discussion that you're talking about? Like, is the right thing inherently obvious to everybody or not?
I wish it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to tread lightly here because I don't purport to have all the answers. And I think of myself as an ethical and moral person. But, I don't want to say that I, can cast judgment on, other people, because I know that there are different circumstances, whether it's sort of economic ability and just all these other human challenges. So I want to sort of stay away from more like that ethical discussion, at least here.
Yeah, no, I don't have the answers either. I'm just always curious. I get those questions a lot. I mean, like in the profession of ethical hacking, first word, people are always like, well, let's talk about ethics. And yeah, so I certainly agreed. I mean, I feel like even people who are the, undisputed thought leaders in ethics struggle with this topic too. So yeah. No need for you to feel like you have to be that person.
I'm not an ethicist, and I know there's a whole just discipline of study around that. And I really have no experience in that. I just, I try to do the right thing. So yeah.
I hear you. Very cool. So when you're working on this paper right now, that's coming out soon, when you guys are investing your time, effort, money, energy into writing a paper like this, what is the desired outcome once the paper is done?
It's a great question. Once a paper is done, again, where our whole aim is to have impact, we intend to get it out to the widest audience possible. But not only that, but to also a very targeted audience. And so the hope is that you get it in front of someone who not only cares about the subject, but could also potentially do something about it. So whether that's in the legislative branch, in the executive branch, for instance, if you're looking to that level, maybe it's state government, maybe it's industry, that sort of thing. And so it certainly depends on the audience, but I think our primary audience is definitely in the federal government. And from there, hopefully, you get in front of people, like I said, and obviously in this pandemic and in a virtual environment, hopefully you can have even wider reach. But typically we might do events around that paper and do sort of a media push, maybe spin off some op-eds. So different ways to get to a customer where they can actually digest that information, because obviously not everyone has the ability to read through a 20, 30, 40, page paper.
Sure.
So, yeah.
One of the things that I have observed, and I've seen a lot of other security professionals talk about at great length as well, is that security is really a leadership challenge, as much as it's a technical problem, no doubt, but it is dead in the water if it's not supported and pursued by leadership. So in the context of the federal government, if we're talking about security as a leadership challenge, and then you talk about the top level of leadership, all the way up to the White House, but then you're at a level that's so far abstracted from the actual profession of security. How should we be thinking about what the responsibility is at the White House level, like in terms of driving what happens in terms of cybersecurity as a national security issue?
Yeah, I think to your point, from the very top, setting those priorities. And I think we've seen, this new administration do that. And also too, within the legislative branch. So, we saw the Cyber Solarium Commission report, for instance, come out last year, and a lot of those legislative recommendations have come, out through the NDAA last year, for instance. And then I know that the executive branch is operationalizing a number of them. So, for instance, with the new national cyber director, for instance, so trying to stand up that office, and not only just trying to operationalize some of those recommendations, but also selecting the right people for those jobs. So you have Chris Inglis, for instance, as the nominee for that job, if he hasn't already been confirmed. You have Jen Easterly as the nominee for the CISA director role. And then you have Ann Newberger, as the cyber person on the NSC. So you have people who are very experienced in this, and have this desire to to continue to serve, but also to to improve things, basically. And that's why I think people do get into public policies to help improve policies for our nation. So prioritizing those sorts of things, looking at installing people who care about and understand these new emerging tech challenges, for instance. Wendy Sherman at the State Department, very interested in, cyber and tech diplomacy, for instance. I'm sure Mayorkas is as well. Actually, no, he's DHS. I'm sorry. I don't know if he scratched that, but again, setting those priorities from the top, and then putting in leaders who share those responsibilities and those desires, and then promulgating those down and getting people in who have those ideas and have the desire to, put the work in to make those changes. And not only that, but I think who have, contacts within industry and academia and that sort of thing. So you can bring, more of a whole of nation response to these issues as well.
Awesome. So from your viewpoint, how do we measure success in security?
Gosh, I haven't been asked that question. Because I don't necessarily think we don't see, a certain number of operations, because I think we're not going to see certain things, especially where the cyber domain does offer a level of, cover, at least for a little while. If you look at SolarWinds, they weren't discovered until, an employee at FireEye inadvertently, kind of took the lid off of that. So I think that there are other metrics or other standards by which you can judge that by. And so, and I do think, the number of, quote unquote, cyber attacks potentially decreasing, especially the ones that are a little bit more noisy. But I think the answer too has to be our own resilience. So building up our defenses, building up our resilience, taking measures to do that, across the board. And I think that's everything from, different companies and different, in states and, sort of, their levels of resilience, but even on the way down to an individual. And, I hate the term cyber hygiene, but, when you have an average person who knows some very simple things that they can do to, raise their own level of security, and then therefore I think that raises it even higher, and then our collective security even higher. And then even, say companies who maybe haven't taken cybersecurity as a priority in the past, for a number of different reasons. Perhaps it's resources and time and just not fully understanding it. But I think seeing those companies, take that responsibility and take it more seriously. And so I think, kind of small things, just raising the level of their own security to raise, the level of our collective security.
I love it. Well, as we come to a close here and wrap up our time together, what would be any parting wisdom or last words that you want to leave with our audience here today?
Gosh, that's a very, very broad question.
What action should we take?
Action should we take? I think going back to what we were just talking about is everyone taking their own personal security more seriously, and at the company level too. And I'm not talking about these big companies that have cybersecurity offices and things like that. That's already happening. But smaller companies and individuals, I think there are some very simple things that we can do. And so understanding that, trying to bake security into certain practices, I think from that standpoint, that would, I think, significantly raise the level of security across the board. Yeah, that's what I would say for what we can do. I think that would be really helpful. And I worry too that cybersecurity, personal security is sort of becoming like a digital commons issue, where before people may not have understood the problem, understood the threat, understood how they can do it. But I worry, and I don't have any evidence of this, but I just worry, are people starting to understand more, but maybe they're just not caring? I don't know. So I'd love to see more of that education and more of that call to action, I guess you can say, and understanding like what happens to your data, and how to use a password manager and things like that. So I think there's a lot we can do, and I think we can start doing it from a young age.
Powerful stuff. I love it. Lauren, thank you so much for being on the show. You've given me a lot to think about, and hopefully our audience as well. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Ted. I really appreciate being here, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you today.
Yeah, same for me. All right, everybody, if you want to learn more about what Lauren's up to or to request to appear on the show yourself, just head over to tedharrington.com/podcast, and we will catch you next time.